The millionaire was shocked to see the nurse wearing his deceased wife's ring. Don't leave this video without first knowing the devastating secret that this nurse hides. Roberto never imagined his life would collapse so suddenly. After almost 2 decades of marriage to Laura, a woman who had been by his side throughout his rise to success, he believed they could face any challenge together. However, life doesn't always follow the script we envision. When Laura was diagnosed with a terminal illness, Roberto's world began to fall apart. He tried everything: the best doctors, the most expensive treatments, even trips abroad in search of a miraculous cure. But nothing could prevent the inevitable. Laura passed away, leaving Roberto alone in their luxurious mansion, which suddenly felt far too big and lifeless. Grief hit him with full force. Roberto, once known for his strength and determination in the business world, now felt vulnerable and broken. His closest friends tried to offer support, but he pushed them away. His family, worried about his state, tried to visit him, but he preferred to retreat into a cold silence. Business meetings, which had once filled his agenda, were replaced by long, solitary days spent staring at the photos of Laura that were scattered throughout the house. The sound of laughter, conversations, and happy memories that used to fill the rooms now seemed like distant, painful echoes. Every corner of the mansion reminded him of Laura's absence, transforming the home into a mausoleum. Slowly, Roberto isolated himself more and more. He rarely left the house, and when he did, it was only to take care of absolutely necessary matters, like settling legal or financial issues related to Laura's estate. The responsibilities of life, which continued to swirl around him, began to be neglected. The plants in the garden withered, mail piled up in the mailbox, and the air in the house grew heavy with sadness. To make matters worse, Roberto suffered a household accident. He fell from a ladder while trying to reach a shelf, resulting in a fractured arm and a few broken ribs. This event marked the point where he realized he couldn't continue alone. Without the strength to care for himself, he was forced to admit that he needed help, even though he hated the idea. After much insistence from his sister, who was genuinely concerned, Roberto relented and agreed to hire a private nurse to help him recover. That's how Camilla came into his life. She was young, around 28, with a calm demeanor and a serene gaze, seeming like the perfect professional. She entered the mansion with a discreet attitude, always respectful and carrying a tranquil presence that contrasted with the somber, intense atmosphere of the house. Despite her competence, Roberto remained distant. To him, Camilla was just a temporary necessity, a physical requirement imposed by his condition. He had no intention of forming any emotional connection with her beyond what was strictly necessary. From the beginning, Roberto made sure to set clear boundaries. Camilla was not to interfere with his routine any more than was required. She administered his medications, prepared his meals, and assisted with his bandages and physical therapy for his arm. Although polite, she didn't push for conversation. Even when she tried to be friendly, Roberto responded with monosyllables or simply nodded, avoiding any form of emotional closeness. However, Camilla's presence began to chip away, albeit slowly, at the wall of indifference Roberto had built around himself. She wasn't intrusive, but her simple existence there, caring for him with patience, began to soften his bitterness. The mornings, which had once been enveloped in absolute silence, now had the faint sounds of clattering pans in the kitchen or the soft footsteps of Camilla as she tidied the house. Small details like the aroma of fresh coffee or the orderliness of the living room reminded Roberto of happier times when Laura was still alive and everything seemed to make sense. But despite these subtle changes, the void left by Laura was still immense. Every night, Roberto returned to an empty bed, staring at the spot where his wife used to lie. He clung to memories, revisiting photos and reliving moments they had shared, all the while struggling to find purpose in a world without her. Life seemed to have lost its luster, and Roberto wondered if he would ever feel anything other than pain again. Thus, between the physical limitations imposed by his accident and the emotional weight of his grief, Roberto continued living in an almost automatic way, barely noticing the passage of days. He saw no future, and the idea of starting over seemed like a burden. Laura's wedding ring, locked away in a safe in his office, was one of the few material reminders he zealously kept. To him, the ring symbolized the unbroken commitment, even in death. Camilla, on the other hand, continued fulfilling her duties, though she sensed the emotional barrier Roberto maintained. She noticed the deep sadness in his eyes even when he tried to hide it. Her intuition told her that Roberto was carrying more than just the pain of the accident, and silently she respected his space, waiting for the day he might be ready to talk about what tormented him. Camilla's presence wasn't enough to heal Roberto, but it was the beginning of something different, something he couldn't quite understand yet. He didn't know that this quiet figure in his home was about to become the catalyst for a revelation that would forever change his perception of Laura and the life they had shared. The days began to pass at a slow but steady pace. The routine between Roberto and Camilla seemed well established. She arrived early, prepared breakfast, and organized the medications. Roberto barely noticed her, lost in his grief, dealing with both the morning and his accident. Camilla worked efficiently and silently, always respectful, and seemed to understand the emotional distance Roberto insisted on maintaining. However, there was something about Camilla that intrigued Roberto, something he couldn't quite define. She was reserved, but her gaze often carried a deep sense of empathy. The patience with which she handled his physical limitations, along with the almost imperceptible way she tidied the house without asking questions, began to stir in him a strange feeling of familiarity, something he didn't want to acknowledge. Perhaps it was the fact that, over time, Camilla seemed to anticipate his needs before he even expressed them. It was as if she was always a step ahead of his desires, with an unsettling accuracy. Though Roberto tried to maintain his cold and distant posture, there were moments when the silence between them was unexpectedly broken. One morning, as Camilla prepared the coffee, Roberto glanced at her briefly, lost in thought. He rarely allowed himself to engage in conversation, but something compelled him to speak that day. "You seem so at ease here, as if you already know this house," he commented, his voice rough and heavy. Camilla, without turning immediately, responded softly. "I adapt quickly to the places I work, Mr. Roberto. I think it's important to create a welcoming environment." That response seemed generic and practical, but the tone in her voice, the gentle way she chose her words, made Roberto feel there was more behind it. He didn't want to pursue the conversation, but a seed of curiosity had been planted. While he tried to convince himself it was simply Camilla's professionalism, something in that response felt too personal. In the following weeks, Camilla continued to care for him with the same precision. Her calm and attentive demeanor, however, did not go unnoticed. She rarely asked about Roberto's personal life, but at times when passing by framed pictures of Laura on the walls, her eyes seemed to linger a little longer than normal. Roberto caught these looks out of the corner of his eye, unable to understand what they meant. One day, after finishing a physical therapy session for his injured arm, Roberto sat on the porch, resting his head in his hands, staring at the horizon. It was a sunny afternoon, but the sunlight didn't seem to warm his heart. Camilla approached to check if he needed anything. For the first time, Roberto chose to break the emotional barrier he had built. "You mentioned you adapt quickly to the houses where you work, but here, it feels like you already know everything. It's as if you know more than you're telling me." Camilla hesitated, her hands tightening around the notebook where she recorded his medication schedules. Her gaze briefly met Roberto's before looking away. "I didn't mean to be intrusive, Mr. Roberto, but I've always admired Laura," she said, her voice softer than usual. Roberto felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't expect to hear Laura's name. Since Camilla had started working there, she had never directly mentioned his wife, always maintaining the professional formality required by her job. Now that unexpected mention stirred something deep within him. "Did you know her?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Know her?" "Not exactly. I saw her a few times at events, interviews. She was a very generous woman. I always admired the work she did with charity foundations, especially with underprivileged children," Camilla replied, her tone light but with a depth that did not escape Roberto. This comment, which could have been trivial coming from anyone else, had a powerful effect on him. Laura had indeed dedicated much of her time to philanthropic work, and her passion for helping children was one of her most enduring legacies. Camilla spoke with such sincerity that Roberto couldn't help but feel a tightness in his chest. It wasn't just admiration for Laura's public persona that he sensed in Camilla's voice. There was something more, something he couldn't define. Over the following days, Roberto began to observe Camilla more closely. He noticed small gestures and details that had previously escaped his attention. She seemed to have a special care for Laura's personal belongings, as if she respected each piece of the legacy of the woman he had loved. At one point, Roberto saw her polishing a picture frame of Laura with a delicate touch, and it made him question, why did Camilla seem so connected to someone she supposedly only admired from afar? These observations accumulated in his mind, creating a puzzle he couldn't fully solve. While Roberto tried to maintain his distance, he started feeling that Camila, in some way, had been part of his life even before she was hired to care for him. It was an uncomfortable feeling, an intuition he couldn't explain, but it grew stronger with each passing day. The relationship between them was still professional, with Camilla expertly fulfilling her role, but the connection Roberto felt, though vague and undefined, was becoming stronger. He began to notice how Camilla looked at Laura's belongings, as if she were familiar with that world. The nurse, in turn, continued her reserved behavior, always withdrawing discreetly when she sensed Roberto wanted to be alone, respecting the space he so fiercely demanded. There was something about her presence that slowly began to break through Roberto's emotional wall. Even though he didn't want to admit it, the loneliness that consumed him had started to dissipate, even if just slightly, by Camilla's calmness. Sometimes he caught himself listening to the sound of her footsteps through the house and feeling a strange comfort. But at the same time, this left him uneasy. There was something hidden there, something he couldn't quite reach, but that was beginning to haunt him. This strange sense of familiarity and connection between him and Camilla was inexplicable. Yet Roberto knew that at some point he would have to confront what he was feeling. Something in Camilla's behavior wasn't what it seemed at first glance, and Roberto felt that a greater truth was hiding behind her presence in the house. He just didn't realize that this truth was closer than he could ever have imagined. It was a quiet and routine night, like so many others since Camilla had arrived. Roberto, after a long day of rehabilitation and silence, decided to dine alone in the mansion's dining room. He had returned to sitting at that immense table, a symbol of the lifestyle he and Laura shared. Grand, but now empty. As usual, Camilla prepared the meal and set the plate for him, then quietly withdrew, not wanting to invade his space. He nearly always ate without saying a word, immersed in memories that haunted him. However, that night, something strange happened. Roberto noticed, in passing, a subtle gleam on Camilla's finger as she placed the silverware on the table. Initially, he ignored it, but when his eyes focused on that detail, a wave of shock hit him. It was Laura's wedding ring. For a moment, Roberto froze, incredulous. The ring was unmistakable, a unique design he himself had commissioned for Laura, adorned with small emeralds surrounding a central diamond. He knew every detail of that piece of jewelry. After Laura's death, Roberto had stored the ring in a safe, along with other items of sentimental value. How could Camilla, his nurse, be wearing something so personal, something he never even thought of showing anyone? Feeling his heart race, he took a deep breath and, on impulse, abruptly stood up from the table. His vision blurred with fury and disbelief, and he walked directly toward Camilla, who was still in the kitchen, busy with her chores. When she turned to respond to Roberto's sudden presence, her eyes widened at the sight of his tense expression. "Why are you wearing my wife's ring?" Roberto asked, his voice trembling between shock and barely contained rage. Camilla was silent for a few seconds, clearly caught off guard. Her eyes dropped to the ring she wore on her ring finger, as if she was only now realizing the terrible mistake she had made. Roberto expected an immediate explanation, a logical response, but what he saw was only hesitation. "Mr. Roberto, I can explain," she said, her voice low and visibly shaken. "Explain?" he repeated, taking a step forward, unable to hold back his fury. "That ring was supposed to be in the safe where I left it. How did you get it? How dare you wear something so personal?" The tension in the air was palpable. The silence that usually filled the house was replaced by a mix of conflicting emotions. Roberto's disbelief, the evident guilt in Camilla's eyes, and the sensation that something much larger was about to be revealed. "I didn't mean for this to happen. Please hear me out," Camilla pleaded. but Roberto's confusion only grew. How could something that belonged to his deceased wife, something he believed to be safely stored, now be on the finger of a woman he barely knew? This made his stomach churn with indignation. For him, that ring symbolized far more than a mere object. It was the physical bond he still had with Laura, the material reminder of a love he had never gotten over. "Listen," Roberto shouted, his voice echoing off the mansion's walls. "How do you expect me to listen to anything when you're wearing my wife's ring, a ring that symbolizes everything I lost? How did you get this, Camilla? Who gave you the right?" Camilla lowered her head, her hands trembling as she tried to remove the ring from her finger, but without immediate success. Roberto watched her with a mixture of horror and perplexity. What was going on? Could she be a thief? Was there some sinister reason behind her presence in his house? Chaotic thoughts raced through his mind as he waited for an explanation that made sense, something that would pull him out of this nightmare. Finally managing to remove the ring, Camilla held it in her hands, looking at Roberto with eyes full of regret and pain. She knew she could no longer delay the truth, that the moment to reveal everything had come. Roberto was on the verge of exploding and needed immediate answers. "I didn't steal it, Mr. Roberto," she said, her voice now steadier, though still charged with emotion. "This ring was given to me by Laura." The room fell silent again, but this time the weight of Camilla's words hung in the air like a punch to the stomach. Roberto stared at her, incredulous, unable to comprehend what she was saying. How could Laura have given her something so important, without his knowing? The discomfort grew inside him, turning into a physical pain. "That's impossible," he muttered, feeling more and more confused. "Laura would never have given that ring to anyone. That ring, it means everything to us. I gave it to her on our wedding day. This makes no sense." Camilla, with tears beginning to form in her eyes, took a step back, still holding the ring delicately. She knew the next words would change everything, that the truth she had kept until now could shatter Roberto's already fragile world. "I know it's hard to believe, Mr. Roberto, but before Laura passed, she and I had a history that you don't know about. She gave me this ring as a symbol, as a request, and I never intended to hurt you or hide this from you. I just didn't know how to tell you." The revelation shook Roberto to his core. He looked at the ring in Camilla's hands as if seeing a ghost. The idea that Laura, in her final moments, had chosen to give such a meaningful piece of jewelry to another person left him bewildered. But there was something else. The fact that Laura had chosen not to tell him what she had done. Why had she decided to hide this? What was she afraid Roberto would feel or think? Roberto's mind was a swirl of pain, confusion, and a new understanding of Laura's complexity. For years, he had placed her on a pedestal, believing their marriage was transparent and perfect. Now he realized that Laura had kept secrets, not to betray him, but perhaps to spare him from further suffering. "She never told me any of this," Roberto said, his voice low and eyes fixed on the floor. "She never mentioned you, and this ring, I always thought it was something just between us." Camila, still holding the ring, took a step forward. "I never wanted to hurt you, Mr. Roberto. Never wanted to make you feel betrayed. But the truth is, Laura did what she did out of love, both for me and for you. She thought you were already carrying too much with her illness, and this story between us didn't need to be another burden for you. I just followed her wishes." The words hit Roberto hard. The pain of losing Laura seemed to resurface as he tried to comprehend the complexities of their marriage and the depths of her emotions. He always saw her as almost perfect, but now he understood that Laura had also struggled with her own demons, her unfulfilled desires, and hidden pains. "I never knew her as well as I thought," Roberto whispered, his voice heavy with sorrow. The mystery of the ring was only beginning to unravel, and with it, secrets Roberto never imagined existed. The air in the mansion seemed heavy as Roberto processed Camilla's revelations. Each word she spoke echoed, extending the impact of the information he had just received. The idea that his late wife, Laura, had a secret relationship with the nurse now living in his home was something he could not immediately accept. For years, Roberto had believed he knew every aspect of Laura's life, that they had shared everything without secrets. Now the image he had of their marriage was about to be deeply shaken. Camilla, aware of the stakes, knew there was no turning back. The inevitable confrontation had finally arrived, and Roberto deserved to know the full truth. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her story before she began to speak. "I understand how shocking this must be, Mr. Roberto," she said, holding the ring carefully in her hands. "But the truth is, Laura and I knew each other long before I started working here, long before I became your nurse. And what happened between us was something she chose to keep secret, not out of malice, but for a reason that, in the end, was about protecting you." Roberto crossed his arms, trying to control his emotions. His mind was in turmoil, full of questions and assumptions, but he managed to force a single word between his clenched lips. "Go on." Camilla sighed, seeming to dive into memories she had buried deep. "Many years ago, when I was still a teenager, my family went through very difficult times. My father abandoned us, and my mother was sick, with no resources to take care of me and my siblings. I was young and desperate, with nowhere to go. It was during that time that I met Laura." Roberto furrowed his brow, trying to recall if Laura had ever mentioned anything about this, but he couldn't remember any such reference. He had always known that Laura had a charitable soul and spent much of her time and energy on philanthropic work. But the name Camilla had never surfaced in their conversations, at least not in a way that Roberto could remember. Camilla continued, her voice low and filled with emotion. "I was lost, Roberto. I was just a girl with shattered dreams, living on the streets, when Laura found me. She was organizing a social project to help girls in vulnerable situations, and I was one of those she helped. She didn't just give me shelter, she gave me a new chance at life." Roberto felt his heart tighten. He could imagine Laura doing such a thing, always generous, always willing to help those in need. But why had she never mentioned Camilla to him? And why had she given Camilla something as personal as her wedding ring? "She was more than a mentor to me," Camilla continued, her voice trembling. "She became like a mother. I never had anyone care for me like she did. She gave me support, paid for my education, and it was she who encouraged me to become a nurse. Everything I am today, I owe to her." Roberto felt a pang of sadness as he listened to those words. On the one hand, he was deeply moved by the impact Laura had on Camilla's life. It was exactly the kind of gesture he would expect from his wife, someone who always put others before herself. But at the same time, the pain of being excluded from such an important part of Laura's life gnawed at him. Why had Laura never told him about Camilla? Why had she kept this part of her life hidden from him? "And the ring?" Roberto asked, pointing to the piece of jewelry that Camilla still held. "Why would Laura give you the ring I gave her at our wedding?" Camilla lowered her eyes to the ring in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. She knew this would be the hardest part to explain. "Shortly before she passed away," Camilla began, her voice faltering, "Laura called me into her room. She was very weak and knew the end was near. That night she gave me this ring, saying it was a symbol of the love and gratitude she felt for me, for being an important part of her life. She told me I should wear it as a reminder that I wasn't alone, that she would always be with me in spirit. I tried to refuse, Roberto, I swear. I knew how much that ring meant to both of you. But Laura insisted and made me promise not to tell you, at least not until the right moment." The revelation shook Roberto. He looked at the ring in Camilla's hands as if seeing it for the first time. The idea that Laura, in her final moments, had decided to give such a significant piece of jewelry to someone else left him confused and hurt. But there was more. The fact that Laura had chosen not to tell him what she had done. Why had she hidden this? What was she afraid he would feel? Roberto's mind was a whirl of pain, confusion, and a new understanding of the complexity of Laura's character. For years, he had placed her on a pedestal, believing their marriage was transparent and perfect. Now he realized that Laura had carried secrets, not out of disloyalty, but to spare him from more suffering. "She never told me any of this," Roberto said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the floor. "She never mentioned you. And this ring, I always thought it was something just between us." Camilla, still holding the ring, took a step forward, her eyes full of tears. "I never wanted to hurt you, Mr. Roberto. I never wanted you to feel betrayed. But the truth is, Laura did what she did out of love, both for me and for you. She thought you were already carrying a burden too heavy with her illness, and that this story between us shouldn't add to your pain. I just, I just followed what she asked. The words hit Roberto hard. The pain of losing Laura seemed to resurface as he realized how much he had been left out of her emotional world. He had always seen her as a near-perfect figure, but now he understood that Laura, too, had carried her own burdens, desires she never shared, and pains she chose to hide. She really saw you as a daughter, Roberto said, more to himself than to Camilla, and I never knew. Camilla nodded, her eyes shining with held-back tears. Yes, and that's why, before she passed, she gave me this ring. She said that, although the love you shared was sacred, she wanted me to know that I too was part of her life in a unique way. The ring wasn't just a reminder of you, but also of me. She made me promise that, when the time was right, I would take care of you, just as she had taken care of me. Roberto felt the weight of those words. The pain of losing Laura seemed to multiply as he understood the complexities of their marriage and the depths of her emotions. He had always seen her as almost perfect, but now he realized that Laura had also struggled with her own demons, unfulfilled desires, and hidden pains. I never wanted to replace her, said Camilla, her voice breaking. Not even to take something that was sacred to both of you. I was just trying to honor the promise I made to Laura. She asked me to stay close to you, to help you get through this, even if you didn't know that I had been part of her life in such an intimate way. Roberto looked at Camilla, and for the first time, he saw beyond the nurse, beyond the woman who had unexpectedly entered his life. He saw someone who had also been deeply marked by Laura, someone who carried her own burden of pain, just like him. He remembered all the times Laura spoke of her charity work with a sparkle in her eyes, how she never talked about her personal failures, but always highlighted her victories in helping others. And now, with Camilla standing before him, everything made sense. Laura had found a way to fill part of the void she felt by helping someone who needed love just as much as she did. Roberto slowly stood up, approaching Camilla. He took the ring from her hands, looking at it for a long moment. That piece of jewelry, which for so long had been a symbol of his marriage, now represented something much deeper. It represented the legacy of kindness and compassion that Laura had left, not just for him, but also for Camilla. I don't understand everything yet, Roberto said, his voice low but firm. But I think in some way, Laura knew what she was doing. She didn't want us to be alone. And maybe somehow we can find a way to move forward. Together. Camilla nodded, tears finally spilling from her eyes. Roberto, for the first time in months, felt that the pain of losing Laura was beginning to ease. Not because it was fading, but because he finally understood that Laura had left much more than memories. She had left a path for him, a path to healing, through Camilla. Roberto was still absorbing the revelations about Laura and Camilla's past. The truth about the bond they shared was something he could never have imagined. The image he had of Laura, always altruistic, began to expand, becoming richer and more complex. Roberto, however, still had many questions, and the weight of those revelations continued to press heavily on his heart. The night after their tense conversation, Roberto realized he needed to know more. There was something in Camilla's words that suggested there were still details left unsaid, something deeper that he needed to understand. Though it was difficult for him to accept that Laura had kept secrets, a part of him understood her motivations. Laura had always been careful to protect those around her, and now he realized that, in the end, she hadn't wanted him to bear more suffering than was necessary. The next day, Roberto asked Camilla for a more intimate conversation. He was still uncomfortable with the idea that someone he barely knew was so deeply connected to his wife, but he knew he couldn't avoid it anymore. If he truly wanted to understand what had happened, he needed to hear the whole truth, no matter how painful. The two sat in the living room, a space where Roberto and Laura had spent countless hours together, discussing life and making plans for the future. Now the room felt different, filled with memories and mysteries that Roberto was still trying to process. Camilla, though visibly uncomfortable, knew that she had to clarify the missing details. Camilla, Roberto began, his voice still laced with a mix of emotions. You've spoken about how Laura helped you, how she gave you shelter. But I feel like there's something more that you haven't told me. There's something deeper about your relationship that I need to know. and I can't go on without fully understanding." Camilla, who had expected this request, took a deep breath before responding. She looked Roberto straight in the eye, and he sensed that what she was about to say would be difficult for both of them. "Mr. Roberto," she began, her voice hesitant but firm, "there is more than just Laura's kindness in my life. I was reluctant to tell you everything all at once, but you deserve to know. Laura was more than just a savior to me. She was like a mother, yes, but our bond was even deeper because, without you knowing, I became her daughter. Not biologically, but emotionally. Laura gave me a second chance at life, but she did more than that." The confession hung in the air like a silent storm. Roberto blinked, surprised, trying to process what Camilla had just said. "Her daughter?" he repeated, confused. "What do you mean by that?" Camilla continued, her voice now trembling but determined. "When Laura found me, I was very young and full of fear. She didn't just offer me shelter and education. She treated me like the daughter she never had. Laura had an enormous emptiness inside her, and though you might not have noticed, she always wanted to be a mother. She told me that before you two got married, there were a few failed attempts at having children. She never talked about it openly, but that desire stayed with her throughout her life." Roberto was overcome with conflicting emotions. Laura had never mentioned this deep desire to him, nor the struggles they had faced in trying to have children. It was as if the wife he had known had lived a double life, not one of betrayal, but one filled with emotions and dreams she had chosen not to share, perhaps out of fear of burdening him. "She never talked to me about that," said Roberto, his gaze distant. He tried to sift through his memories, searching for any signs that Laura had mentioned her desire to have children. She had always been very private about certain aspects of her personal life, but he had never imagined that such an important issue had been hidden from him. Camilla looked at him with compassion. "I know it's hard to believe, but I also know that she never wanted you to feel responsible for that emptiness. When she found me, something changed inside her. I became, in a way, the daughter she never had. She never wanted you to know because she feared that it would cause you pain, as if by creating a maternal bond with me, she was somehow replacing that unfulfilled desire." Roberto felt a wave of sadness and regret. While he understood why Laura had made that decision, he couldn't help but feel the pain of having been left out of such an essential part of her life. Perhaps if he had known sooner, they could have shared that sorrow and worked through it together. But Laura, as always, had chosen to bear that burden alone. "She really saw you as a daughter," Roberto said, more to himself than to Camilla. "And I never knew." Camilla nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Yes, and that's why, before she died, she gave me this ring. She said that while the love you two shared was sacred, she wanted me to know that I was also a part of her life in a unique way. The ring wasn't just a reminder of you, but also of me. She made me promise that when the time was right, I would take care of you, just as she had taken care of me." Roberto felt the weight of those words. The pain of losing Laura had been hard enough, but now he realized that there was an entire side of his wife's emotional world he had never been part of. The years they spent together, the love they shared, had been real, but they had also been marked by Laura's own private struggles. Roberto slowly stood up, still trying to process everything. "I never knew how much she was carrying on her own," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I thought we shared everything, but now I see that Laura was protecting me. She was protecting both of us." Camilla, her voice barely above a whisper, said, "She loved you more than anything, Mr. Roberto, but she also didn't want to burden you with the parts of her that she thought would bring you more pain. She thought she was sparing you." Roberto looked at Camilla, and for the first time he felt a sense of clarity. Though Laura had kept her bond with Camilla a secret, he understood now that it had come from a place of love. She had found in Camilla the daughter she never had, and in her final moments, she had tried to leave behind a legacy that would protect both of them. The ring, which had once symbolized only his marriage to Laura, now held an entirely different meaning. It wasn't just a reminder of their love, but a bridge between the life Laura had lived and the lives she had touched. "Maybe Laura knew more than we did," Roberto said quietly. "She wanted us to find each other. She wanted you to take care of me. And maybe, Maybe she wanted me to take care of you too. Camilla nodded, wiping away her tears. I think she knew deep down that we would need each other. With time, Roberto began to see Camilla not as a stranger who had invaded his life, but as a part of Laura's legacy. He realized that Laura's gift to both of them was more than just the ring. It was the chance to heal, together, from the pain of losing her. Though the wounds of grief still hurt, Roberto found comfort in knowing that Laura's love had not disappeared. It had simply transformed, manifesting through Camilla's presence in his life. They both carried the weight of Laura's absence, but also the strength of her memory. As the days passed, Roberto and Camilla grew closer, not as a father and daughter, but as two people deeply connected by the same source of love. They began to share memories of Laura, to laugh about the good times and to cry over the painful moments. Together, they created a space where Laura's spirit could continue to live on, not through sadness, but through the bond they now shared. In the end, Roberto realized that Laura had left him far more than memories. She had left him a path forward, a way to find peace and companionship in the most unexpected of places. After the devastating but enlightening revelations about Laura and Camilla's past, Roberto felt that something inside him had shifted. The pain of grief, which had once seemed insurmountable, began to transform. It hadn't disappeared. The loss of Laura was still an open wound, but now it carried a new context, a deeper understanding of who Laura truly was and how she had shaped the lives of so many people around her, especially Camilla. In the days following that revealing conversation, Roberto began to notice that his relationship with Camilla had changed irreversibly. Previously, he had seen her merely as a caregiver, someone hired to help him physically recover after the accident. But now he saw her as part of Laura's emotional legacy. Camilla was no longer just a nurse. She was a living link to Laura's generous and maternal spirit, which Roberto had only partially known. The uncomfortable silence that had once lingered between them started to dissolve. Roberto, who had spent so much time isolated, found himself for the first time in months desiring a real connection with someone. That person, surprisingly, was Camilla. Not because she replaced Laura, but because she, too, carried the marks of Laura's love and influence. They were united by their grief, but also by their shared admiration and gratitude for Laura, who, even in death, remained the force that bound them together. One night, Roberto invited Camilla to dine with him at the main dining table, a gesture he had never made before. Camilla hesitated at first, still respectful of her role, but Roberto insisted. He needed to take that first step, to show that he was willing to open space for something new, even though it was unfamiliar. During the dinner, Roberto felt lighter than he had at any other point since Laura's death. They began by talking about trivial things, the weather, the flowers still blooming in the garden, the news he had barely followed in recent months. But as time passed, Roberto felt the need to talk about Laura, something he had avoided for so long. "Did she talk about me much?" Roberto asked, his voice hesitant, as if the question could unearth emotions too deep to handle. Camilla smiled sadly, setting her utensils aside. "Yes, Mr. Roberto, always. She spoke about you with so much love. Even in the hardest moments, when the illness was advancing and she felt like she was losing her strength, she never stopped believing that the bond between you two was special." Roberto took a deep breath. Knowing that comforted him somewhat, easing the pain he had carried, the feeling that Laura had kept secrets not out of distrust, but out of protection. The image he had of their marriage, though altered, was starting to rebuild itself under a new light. "I don't think I ever realized how much Laura cared for everyone around her," he continued, his eyes fixed on the glass in front of him. "She was so good at hiding the hardest parts of herself, always focusing on others. Now that I know about the two of you, I feel like I understand a little more about the woman she was." Camilla nodded. "She always put others before herself, and I think, in a way, it made her happy. But I also think she didn't want to bring more worry to you. She always said your love was what kept her strong, even on the worst days." Those words brought Roberto a sense of peace, though a part of him still mourned Laura's absence. But with Camilla there, he realized he wasn't completely alone. Camilla, in a way, was a continuation of Laura's kindness, a living testament to how his wife had touched the world. As the weeks passed, Roberto and Camilla grew more comfortable around each other. He began to accept her not only as a physical caregiver, but as someone with whom he could share his grief and memories. Together, they started revisiting memories of Laura, not with the weight of sadness, but with a deep gratitude for all that she had represented. One day while they were in the garden, Laura's favorite place, Roberto turned to Camilla and said something he had been thinking about for some time. You know, Laura considered you like a daughter, and now I'm beginning to understand why. You have the same light she had. Camilla, surprised by his words, smiled shyly. I just try to follow the example she gave me. She taught me to be strong, to have compassion, and in the end, she asked me to take care of you. I think that, in some way, this is how I can honor her. Roberto nodded, feeling a surge of emotion. She knew what she was doing. Maybe I never fully understood it, but now I see that Laura was preparing us for this moment when we would need each other. Over time, the house, which had once felt so cold and empty, began to feel alive again. Roberto started to open up more, to welcome visits from friends and family, and most importantly, to reconnect with the world around him. He knew the pain of losing Laura would never completely go away, but with Camilla by his side, he felt he could move forward, without forgetting the past, but without letting it imprison him either. Camilla, for her part, also found a new way to live. The burden of her promise to Laura had been lightened as her relationship with Roberto evolved. They never explicitly talked about the promise, but both knew that, in some way, they were fulfilling Laura's wishes, caring for each other, sharing memories, and most importantly, living their lives with the kindness and compassion Laura had left behind as her legacy. In the end, the ring Laura had given to Camilla was not just a symbol of a past love, but a bridge between what had been and what was to come. By accepting this truth, Roberto finally found a way to honor Laura's memory without being consumed by grief. He came to see Camilla not as a replacement, but as an extension of everything Laura had represented: strength, care, and the ability to transform lives. On the final night of autumn, as the leaves fell softly in the garden, Roberto and Camilla sat together in silence, contemplating the landscape. Words weren't necessary anymore. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was a shared space filled with understanding and acceptance. They had faced the pain, the secrets, and the truth together, and emerged stronger, connected by something greater than themselves: Laura's love and legacy. And so, Roberto finally found peace. Not because he had completely overcome the loss of his wife, but because he understood that in some way she was still present, through the people she had touched and the lessons she had left behind for both of them. His journey of redemption and healing was complete, and now he could move forward, not alone, but with someone by his side who shared his path of pain and overcoming. If this story moved you and held you until the end, don't leave without leaving a like. This helps us continue to bring you more content full of drama, mystery, and twists. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity now to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our next videos, which are even more surprising. There are many more incredible stories waiting for you. Click here and discover other videos full of secrets, betrayals, and unexpected endings that will leave you with your mouth open. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.